There is one episode of The Simpsons that nobody on Earth can watch anymore. The people who made it reached back into their own show and erased it completely, on purpose, until it became a ghost. And that is only the beginning of the trouble. Over the years, this little yellow cartoon family feuded with a sitting president, enraged an entire American city, drew a lawsuit threat from a whole country, and got banned outright in another. Two of its episodes were quietly made to vanish by a powerful government. One was nearly killed before it aired by its own network. A beloved character was retired after years of painful debate, and one episode disappeared the morning a real tragedy struck New York. Tonight, every one of those stories gets told, slow and soft and calm, so you can drift off while a silly cartoon quietly takes on the whole world. Welcome to Yellowfan. Let's get started. The family that took on the White House. In 1989, a bright yellow cartoon family showed up on television, and almost nobody watching had any idea how much fighting, apologizing, and bad blood these little characters were about to set off over the next 30 years. The Simpsons did not start out big. The family first appeared as tiny clips stuffed inside another program called The Tracy Ullman Show. The drawings back then looked rough. The voices were still finding their feet, and each clip ran only a minute or two. People liked them anyway. By the end of 1989, the family had earned a half-hour show of their own on the Fox network, and inside of a year, they had grown into one of the most talked about things on all of American television. Bart was the one who turned into a star first. He was loud, he talked back to grown-ups, and he did not care much for school or rules. Kids loved him for it. Soon his face was on shirts in every shopping mall in the country. One shirt had him saying he was an underachiever and proud of it. That little line, printed on a piece of cotton, was enough to make a lot of parents and teachers very nervous. Some schools went so far as to ban the shirts, telling students they were not allowed to wear them in class. Grown-ups worried that a rude cartoon boy was teaching their children to be lazy and disrespectful. A funny drawing on the Fox network had somehow become a thing that serious adults argued about at dinner tables and in newspaper columns. All of that noise was background hum compared to what came next. The complaints went straight to the very top, to the White House, where the President of the United States and his wife lived. It began with the First Lady. In the fall of 1990, Barbara Bush, the wife of President George H.W. Bush, sat down for an interview with a magazine called People. When the subject of the new cartoon came up, she did not hold back. She called The Simpsons the dumbest thing she had ever seen. Those were strong words coming from the most famous woman in the country, and they landed hard. A sitting First Lady had looked at a cartoon family and decided they were not worth anyone's time. Most shows would have let a comment like that slide and moved on. The people who wrote The Simpsons did something cleverer and stranger. They sat down and wrote a polite letter back, but they did not write it as themselves. They wrote it as Marge Simpson, the kind and patient cartoon mother of the family. In the letter, written in Marge's gentle voice, she explained that she was only trying to raise her family the best she could, and that it had hurt her feelings to hear such an important lady call them dumb. The whole thing was a joke, of course, since Marge is a drawing and cannot hold a pen. The joke worked beautifully. Barbara Bush actually wrote back, and to her great credit, her reply was warm and kind. She said sorry. She admitted she had been a little hard on the family and wished them well. For a short while, it looked like the whole thing had ended in the friendliest way possible. A real First Lady and a cartoon mom making peace through the mail. The peace did not last. A short time later, a Simpsons episode aired that showed a cartoon version of Barbara Bush sitting in a bathtub inside the White House. The drawing was harmless and silly, but it made clear that the show was not going to leave the Bush family alone. The writers had found a target they enjoyed, and they kept poking. Then the president himself stepped in. In early 1992, during a speech, George H.W. Bush said something that would be remembered for decades. He told the crowd that he wanted to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons. The Waltons was an old television show about a sweet, hard-working family living through tough times long ago. By holding the Waltons up as the good example and the Simpsons as the bad one, the president had done something almost unheard of. He had used a speech to scold a cartoon by name. A drawing of a family had become a stand-in for everything he thought was going wrong with the country. The show did not wait long to answer. The writers moved fast and added a brand new opening to a rerun that was about to air. In the new bit, the cartoon family is sitting on their couch watching the president's speech on their own television. After Bush finishes saying families should be more like the Waltons, Bart turns and says that the Simpsons are just like the Waltons because both families are praying for an end to the hard times. The line was sharp and funny and a little bit proud. With one quick joke, written and slipped into a rerun in a matter of days, the show had answered the President of the United States, and gotten the last word. For a few years, the fight cooled down. The episodes kept coming, the show kept growing, and the feud of the Bush family slipped into the background. But the writers had not forgotten. They were quietly waiting for the right moment to settle the whole thing in the biggest way they could think of, which was to build an entire episode around it. That episode arrived in early 1996, and it carried the name Two Bad Neighbors. The idea behind it was simple and bold. The former president, George Bush, and his wife Barbara move into the empty house right across the street from The Simpsons. From the moment they unpack their boxes, trouble is waiting. The old president takes a quick liking to the neighbor on the other side, the cheerful and well-behaved Ned Flanders. Bart, though, is a different story. Bart calls grown-ups by their first names, plays pranks, and generally drives the old president up the wall. The breaking point comes when Bart gets hold of the pages of a book the former president is writing about his own life and feeds them straight into a small motor, shredding them into confetti. Furious, the old president grabs Bart and gives him a spanking. That is the spark that sets the whole house on fire, at least as far as Homer is concerned. No one gets to lay a hand on Homer's boy except Homer. From there, the two grown men, a former leader of the free world and a fat, lazy cartoon dad, fall into a full-blown war. Homer and Bart fire little bottle rockets at the old man's window. He fights back by tearing up their yard with his car and hanging a banner that reads, "Two Bad Neighbors." The two of them trick him into coming outside by using cardboard cutouts shaped like his real-life sons, and once he is out in the open, they glue a clown wig onto his head. By the end, the old president has had enough of the whole street, and he packs up and moves out. The house does not stay empty for long. Another former president, Gerald Ford, moves in next, and he turns out to be a perfect match for Homer. Almost the second he arrives, Ford invites Homer over to watch football and eat nachos and drink beer, and the two of them become instant best friends. The message tucked inside that ending was clear and a little cheeky. A stiff, grumpy neighbor could never get along with Homer, but a relaxed, easygoing one fit right in. The writers were careful about how they aimed all of this. Years later, the people who ran the show explained that they had tried hard to keep the episode from feeling like an attack on Bush's side of politics. One of the head writers, Bill Oakley, put it plainly. He said the episode was a personal jab, not a political one. The goal was to poke fun at the old president for being crabby and easily annoyed, not to argue about laws or elections. Another of the show's leaders said much the same, that they worked to keep the politics out of it and the comedy in. There is a small, strange detail buried in how the episode came together. In the earliest plans, the neighbor who moves in after Bush was supposed to be a different former president named Richard Nixon. Then, Nixon died, in real life, in 1994, while the episode was still being shaped. The writers swapped him out. For a moment, they thought about using a famous politician named Bob Dole instead, but in the end, they landed on Gerald Ford. They felt Ford, easygoing and a little clumsy, was the president who best matched Homer's own personality. So the show chased its joke through real-life deaths and changes until it found the perfect punchline. One more piece of this story is worth sitting with because it shows the fight was more real than people guessed. James L. Brooks, one of the most important people behind The Simpsons, once found himself at a fancy private dinner where George and Barbara Bush were the guests of honor. Brooks had always figured the whole feud was good, clean fun, the kind of thing everybody laughs about later. He walked over, introduced himself, and quickly learned that things were not quite so warm and friendly after all. The Bush family, it turned out, had taken at least some of it to heart. A cartoon had managed to leave a real mark on a real president and his wife. When the dust settled, the lesson of these early years was a big one, and the show would carry it forward for the rest of its long life. A silly drawing about a yellow family had stood toe-to-toe with the White House, traded letters with a first lady, answered a president's speech inside of a week, and then built a whole episode just to win the argument once and for all. The Simpsons had learned that it could aim its jokes at the most powerful people alive and walk away just fine. That knowledge made the writers braver. It also made them targets. Once a show decides it will poke anyone, no matter how important, it is only a matter of time before someone pokes back even harder. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The trouble with the Bush family had stayed personal the whole way through. One cartoon household squabbling with one real one. The next time the show reached for an easy laugh, the joke would land on a real place full of real people. A famous American city with a long memory and a lot of pride. The folks who live there would not find it funny in the slightest. The complaints would pour in by the hundreds within hours, and for the first time, the writers would scramble to say sorry before the week was out. Section 2. The song that made a whole city angry. In the early fall of 1992, only a few months into the show's fourth year, The Simpsons aired an episode that proved a single song could do more damage than a whole season of pranks. The episode was called called A Streetcar Named Marge, and on the surface, it was one of the sweeter stories the show had told. Marge spends most of her days cooking, cleaning, and looking after everyone else in the house. She decides she wants something that belongs to her alone, something fun and grown up and a little bit hers. So she tries out for a part in a local play being put on by people in her town. The play is a singing version of a famous old stage story called A Streetcar Named Desire. The man directing it is a loud, fussy, dramatic fellow named Llewellyn Sinclair, voiced by the comic actor John Lovitz. Sinclair is the kind of director who treats every small thing like a matter of life and death, and snaps at anyone who breathes wrong. Marge, calm and patient as always, manages to win the lead role, a southern woman named Blanche. For once, the story is about Marge chasing her own little dream, and the early part of the episode is gentle and kind. Then the curtain goes up on opening night, and the trouble begins with the very first number. The musical kicks off with a big, splashy song all about the city the play is set in, the city of New Orleans down in the American South. A line of performers belts it out at the top of their lungs, and the words they sing are brutal. The song calls New Orleans the home of pirates, drunks, and whores. It says that if a person wants to visit a truly wicked place, they should take a trip to what it calls the Sodom and Gomorrah on the Mississippi, an old phrase that means a city so sinful it deserves to be wiped off the map. The song does not stop there. It piles on word after ugly word, calling the city stinking, rotten, and vile, then putrid and foul, then crummy, lousy, rancid, and rank. Verse after verse, the number does nothing but list the worst things one could ever say about a place, all set to a cheerful, bouncy tune. Now, the writers thought they were safe. The song was built as a joke on itself. It was meant to copy the style of grand stage musicals that open with a big number running down a city, and the whole point was that it went so far over the top that no sane person could take it as a real opinion. The writers figured the words were so wildly mean that everyone would understand it as a silly exaggeration and laugh along. That guess turned out to be very wrong. The problem started before the episode even reached most homes. A newspaper down in New Orleans, the Times-Picayune, somehow got hold of the lyrics ahead of time and printed them for everyone in the city to read. Sitting there in black and white on a page, stripped of the music and the cartoon and the joke, the words looked nothing like comedy. They looked like a flat-out insult aimed straight at the people reading them. Folks in New Orleans opened their morning paper and saw a national television show calling their home a pit full of drunks and worse. By the time the episode actually aired, the anger was already boiling. People reached for their phones. The local Fox station in the area, the one carrying the show to homes in that part of the country, got swamped. On the night the episode premiered, that one station alone received close to 200 calls from upset viewers. 200 angry phone calls about a single cartoon song, all on one evening in one city. The message was loud and clear. New Orleans did not think the joke was funny, and it wanted somebody to answer for it. Somebody did. The complaints climbed all the way up to the top of the Fox network. The head of the whole company, a man named Jamie Kellner, stepped in and did something networks almost never do over a cartoon. He put out a public apology. The very next day after the uproar, Kellner spoke up on behalf of the network, said sorry to the people of New Orleans, and made clear that the song had been meant as a goofy exaggeration and not as a real swipe at the city or the folks who live there. The man running one of the biggest television networks in America had to stand up and apologize because of a 4-minute song in a children's-style cartoon. The show itself was not going to stay silent either. The people who made The Simpsons came up with their own apology, and they tucked it into the start of the very next episode. At the beginning of most episodes back then, Bart would be shown writing the same sentence over and over on the chalkboard at school as punishment. For the episode that aired the week after the New Orleans mess, the chalkboard line was changed to fit the moment. Bart writes again and again that he will not defame New Orleans. To defame a place means to say nasty, untrue things about it that hurt its good name. So the show, in its own cheeky way, was admitting it had crossed a line and promising not to do it again. One of the people in charge of the show at the time, Al Jean, later talked about the whole strange ordeal. He admitted they had been caught completely off guard. He said they truly did not realize people would get so mad over the song, and he joked that the chalkboard line was the best apology they could squeeze into 8 words or less. There was something honest in that. The show had not set out to wound anyone. The writers had simply misjudged how a joke would land once it left the safety of the cartoon cartoon and hit the real world. What happened next is the part that makes the whole story warm instead of bitter. The fight did not drag on for years. The anger faded fairly fast, and New Orleans, a city that loves a good party more than almost anywhere on earth, found a way to laugh about it. When the city held its huge yearly street celebration the following winter, the famous New Orleans Mardi Gras of 1993, the people there did something wonderful. They let a person dressed up in a full Bart Simpson costume ride along as a grand marshal, one of the special guests of honor leading a parade. The very show that had insulted the city was now being welcomed into its biggest celebration, with Bart himself rolling down the street to cheers. The hatchet had been well and truly buried. The story might have ended there as a tidy little lesson, but the New Orleans song had one more strange chapter waiting many years down the road. In the late summer of 2005, a terrible storm called Hurricane Katrina slammed into New Orleans and flooded huge parts of the city, destroying homes and forcing thousands of people to flee. It was one of the worst disasters the country had ever seen, and the whole world watched New Orleans suffer on the news. Right in the middle of all that heartbreak, a television channel over in the United Kingdom called Channel 4 went ahead and aired this very episode, the one with the cruel song about New Orleans, just about a week after the flood. The timing felt heartless to many people watching. Viewers in Britain were upset that a song mocking the city as a stinking rotten pit would be played for laughs while the real city lay underwater. Complaints were filed once again, this time across an ocean and 13 years after the episode first aired. A single song had managed to stir up trouble twice in two different countries more than a decade apart. Looking back, the New Orleans song marked an important turning point for the show. The fight with the Bush family had been one household arguing with another, a back and forth between cartoon parents and a real president. This time, the joke had landed on an entire city packed with thousands of real people, and those people pushed back, together, all at once, fast and hard. The show learned a lesson it would need again and again in the years ahead. When a joke is aimed at a real place on the map, the folks who live there will not see a clever little gag. They will see their home being kicked, and they will answer as a group, and they will not wait politely for permission to be angry. The writers also learned how to do something they would end up doing many more times. They learned how to apologize quickly, slip the apology into the show itself, and move on before the storm grew any bigger. For a little while after that, the show kept its sharpest jokes pointed at made-up towns and made-up people, the safe targets that could never call a television station or write to a newspaper. That caution would not hold forever. The writers liked sending the family on big trips far from home, and the wider the family wandered, the bigger the real places they would end up making fun of. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The apology had calmed one American city and turned old enemies into parade buddies. Before long, though, the show would stretch its map far past the borders of the United States and drop the family down in a warm, sunny country to the south, a place famous for its beaches and its parties. And the show would paint that country so badly, fill it with so much crime and so many wild stereotypes, that the country's own leaders would stop laughing and start talking out loud and in public about dragging the Simpsons into a courtroom. Section 3. The trip to Brazil that nearly ended in court. By the spring of 2002, The Simpsons had been on the air for more than a dozen years, and the show was no longer just an American favorite. It played in homes all over the world, in dozens of languages, watched by millions of people in countries the writers had probably never visited. That worldwide fame made the show bigger and richer than ever. It also meant that when the writers made fun of a faraway place, the people in that place could now watch it happen and answer back. In the 13th season, the show sent the family on a trip to a real country far from home, and the result was the closest The Simpsons ever came to being hauled into an actual courtroom. The episode was called Blame It on Lisa. Sending the family abroad was not a new trick by this point. The writers had figured out years earlier that dropping The Simpsons into a foreign country was a reliable way to mine fresh jokes, and they had done it before. A few years back, the family had taken a famous trip to Australia, an episode stuffed wall to wall with big, goofy, exaggerated ideas about that country. A handful of Australians had grumbled about being painted as cartoonish, but most took it in good humor, and that episode went on to become a fan favorite that nobody truly fought over. The writers seemed to feel that Australia was a friendly equal, a country enough like America that a little teasing between pals would land softly. Brazil, as they were about to learn, would not go nearly so smoothly. The same recipe that had charmed one nation would enrage another. The story starts in a sweet enough way. Marge finds out the family has run up a giant phone bill, more than $400, from calls placed all the way to Brazil. After a bit of digging, Lisa admits she is the one who made the calls. She has been sending money to help a poor orphan boy named Ronaldo Ronaldo, who lives in Brazil, and she has been phoning to stay in touch with him. When Lisa calls the place that looks after Ronaldo to check on him, she gets worrying news. The boy has gone missing, and the people running the orphanage keep pushing her to send even more money. Kind-hearted as ever, Lisa convinces the family that they need to fly down to Brazil themselves and find out what happened to him. There is a small, funny moment before they even land. Bart proudly tells everyone that he has been studying hard and has learned to speak Spanish, so he can talk to people once they arrive. Marge gently breaks the news to him that people in Brazil do not speak Spanish at all. They speak Portuguese. It is a quick little joke, but it sets the tone for the whole trip, because almost nothing the family thinks they know about Brazil turns out to be right. That small mix-up would later look like a warning sign, because the whole episode was built on a shaky understanding of the country it was making fun of. What the family finds when they reach the city of Rio de Janeiro is where the trouble truly begins. The show paints Rio as a wild, scary, broken down place. The streets are crawling with monkeys and rats. Crowds of people dance through the roads in long lines called conga trains, and the only way the family can seem to get anywhere is to jump into one of these dancing lines and be carried along, as though no one in the entire city ever simply walks from one place to another. Children who have no homes pickpockets and beg. The whole city comes across as a kind of dangerous jungle dressed up as a town, a place where nothing works and no one is safe. Things get worse for the family fast. Homer climbs into a taxi and the driver turns out to be a kidnapper. Instead of taking Homer where he asked to go, the driver and a partner haul him deep into the rainforest and hold him there against his will. Then they force Homer to phone home and tell his family that he will only be set free if they hand over $50,000. The poor Simpsons do not have anywhere near that kind of money, and the family spends a stretch of the episode scrambling to gather a fortune they do not possess. While all of that is going on, Bart wanders too close to a giant snake and gets swallowed whole, gulped down in one big bite like a mouse. The boy survives, naturally, but the image of a child being eaten by a snake in the streets of a real city stuck with a lot of viewers. There is more. While flipping through Brazilian television, Bart lands on a children's program that is clearly meant for little kids, but is filled with a grown-up dancer behaving in a way that is far too racy for a young audience. The show was poking fun at real children's programs from that part of the world, and it did so in a way that made Brazilian kids television look cheap and improper. On top of all that, the episode tossed in a flat-out wrong fact. It claimed that a famous dance song called the Macarena had been born in Brazil, which is not true at all. The Macarena actually came from Spain, a completely different country on the other side of the ocean. So the episode managed to be both insulting and incorrect in the very same breath. The mistakes did not stop with the music. The geography of the whole adventure was badly muddled too. When Homer gets carried off by his kidnappers, he ends up deep in the Amazon rainforest, and the story acts as if that vast jungle sits right next to Rio de Janeiro. In real life, the two places are enormously far apart, separated by a distance about as great as the stretch between one coast of the United States and the other. To a Brazilian watching at home, it was a little like a foreign cartoon claiming that the deserts of the American Southwest were just a short stroll from the streets of New York. The errors piled up until the whole portrait felt less like an honest joke about Brazil and more like a careless sketch drawn by someone who had never bothered to learn the first thing about the place. To the writers, all of this was just the usual Simpsons silliness cranked up loud. To the people of Brazil, it looked like a slap in the face. The timing made everything far worse. At that exact moment, the city of Rio de Janeiro was working hard to bring more visitors to Brazil. There was a group whose entire job was to make the city look good to the rest of the world and convince travelers to come spend their vacations there. That group, the city's tourism board, called Rioter, had poured millions of dollars into ads and campaigns showing Rio as a beautiful, safe, sunny paradise. Brazil's National Tourism Office had been pushing the same hopeful message to the wider world. Then The Simpsons came along and, in 1/2 hour, showed the whole planet a version of Rio that was rotten with crime, kidnappers, rats, and wild animals. Years of careful work and piles of money seemed to be undone by a single cartoon, beamed into millions of living rooms across the globe. The people of Rio were not about to let that slide. About a week after the episode first aired, Rioter came forward and announced that it was planning to take Fox to court. The group said the show had badly damaged the good name of their city and could scare travelers away, costing real businesses real money. This was no angry phone call from a single viewer. This was an official body, backed by a real plan to sue one of the largest television companies in America. And then it climbed even higher than that. The leader of the entire country, the president of Brazil at the time, a man named Fernando Henrique Cardoso, spoke up in support of the complaint. He said the episode had handed the rest of the world a twisted, false picture of what Brazil was really like. When the president of a nation personally steps forward to scold a cartoon, the joke has has clearly traveled far beyond anything the writers expected. A drawing of a yellow family on a Sunday night comedy had managed to upset the head of state of a country with well over 100 million people living in it. There was one part of the episode that seemed to sting the Brazilians more than any other. A man who spoke for the Rio tourism group later explained what had bothered his boss the most. It was the monkeys. The picture the show painted of Rio as a place overrun by monkeys, as if the whole city were nothing more than a wild jungle, was the insult that cut the deepest. To the people of Rio, a proud and modern city full of tall buildings and busy streets, being shown as a jungle full of apes felt like the cruelest jab of all. Brazilian newspapers and television piled on as well, and many of them pointed out something especially galling. A good number of the jokes were not even really about Brazil at all. They were lazy, generic gags that could have been aimed at almost any country in that whole part of the world, tossed at Brazil without any care for what made the place actually itself. Being insulted was bad enough. Being insulted carelessly by people who had not even done their homework felt worse. The man at the very top of The Simpsons stepped in to calm things down. The same producer who had helped smooth over earlier fights, James L. Brooks. He put out an apology and was perfectly polite about it, saying sorry to the lovely city and the lovely people of Rio de Janeiro. But Brooks being Brooks, he could not resist adding a joke to the end of his own apology. He said that if the kind words did not settle the matter, then Homer Simpson would be happy to take on the president of Brazil in a boxing match on a Fox program. So even while saying sorry, the show was still cracking wise about the whole affair, unable to fully put down the very habit that had caused the mess in the first place. The writers, for their part, were not nearly as sorry as the apology made them sound. After learning that the monkey jokes had been the thing that hurt the most, they did something a little bold and a little petty. They turned the monkeys into a running joke that they sprinkled into later episodes. In one episode down the line, Homer mentions, almost in passing, that the monkey problem in Rio is getting worse. In another, Krusty the Clown explains that government officials keep bothering him because his little monkey sidekick happens to come from Brazil. The writers had heard exactly which joke landed hardest, and they decided to keep poking the same sore spot on purpose, again and again, tucked into stories that had nothing to do with Brazil at all. It was their quiet, stubborn way of refusing to fully back down, a wink to anyone paying close attention that they had not really learned their lesson. In the end, all the talk of a lawsuit fizzled out. The leader of the Rio tourism group looked into taking real legal steps, weighed his options, and eventually let the whole thing go. No courtroom battle ever happened. The anger cooled, just as it had cooled in New Orleans years before, though it took a little longer this time. The episode itself paid a quiet price for all the fuss. It aired only a small handful of times before becoming one of those episodes that hardly ever gets shown in reruns, tucked away and skipped over while flashier, friendlier episodes played again and again. The trip to Brazil became a kind of cautionary tale within the show's own history. The vacation that went so wrong it nearly ended in a lawsuit. The whole mess taught the show something new and a little frightening. The fight with the Bush family had been personal, just two households trading blows. The New Orleans song had angered a single American city full of proud people. Brazil was a giant leap past both of those. For the first time, an entire foreign country had taken offense as one. Its tourism leaders had threatened a lawsuit, and its president had spoken out against a cartoon by name. The show had grown so big and reached so far that it could now bruise the feelings of whole nations across the sea. With that kind of power came a brand new kind of risk, because every country has its own raw spots, its own things it will not allow anyone to mock, and the writers could not always guess where those lines were drawn until they had already stomped right across them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Brazil had threatened a courtroom and then quietly walked away from the fight. Far across the world, in a very different land, the show was about to aim a joke at something far more dangerous than a city's good name. It would make fun of the single most respected person in an entire nation, a man treated by his people as almost holy, the kind of figure no one in that country would ever dare to laugh at. And that nation would not waste time with lawyers or apologies or boxing matches. It would simply lock the episode away in the dark and make sure that, for as long as the show stayed on the air, that one trip would never, ever be allowed to play on its televisions. Section 4. The Emperor and the episode Japan refused to show. In the spring of 1999, near the end of the show's 10th year, The Simpsons aired the final episode of the season and managed to do something it had never quite done before. The show made a joke so far out of bounds that an entire country decided the episode could never be shown there at all. No lawsuit, no angry phone calls, no apology traded back and forth. The country simply shut the door and kept it shut. The episode was called 30 Minutes Over Tokyo, a name borrowed and twisted from the title title of an old war movie, and the reason for the ban came down to a few seconds of cartoon involving the most respected person in all of Japan. To understand why those few seconds caused so much trouble, it helps to know how much the family had grown by then. By 1999, the show was watched in homes around the globe. The same writers who had once squabbled with a president and angered a single American city were now sending the family on big adventures to real places far away, and the whole world was watching. That reach made the show powerful. It also meant the writers were now wandering into countries where certain people and certain ideas were treated as sacred, the kind of things a person living there would never dream of laughing at. America has very few figures that everyone agrees are off limits. Japan had one such figure, sitting right at the heart of the country's identity, and the show was about to walk straight into him. The story begins, as so many Simpsons stories do, with money trouble. While the family is hanging around an internet cafe, the local crook named Snake quietly robs them, draining the savings they had been setting aside for a vacation. With their dream trip suddenly gone, the family stumbles into a seminar run by a smooth-talking man named Chuck Garabedian, who promises to teach everyone how to take vacations on the cheap. Following his advice, the Simpsons buy super cheap, last-minute plane tickets to a mystery destination, the kind where a person does not find out where the plane is going until it is too late to back out. The mystery flight lands them in Japan, a country none of them had planned to visit and none of them know the first thing about. At first, the trip plays for gentle laughs. Japan is shown as a land of strange and fancy gadgets. There's a toilet loaded with so many buttons and features that it baffles the whole family, doing things a toilet has no business doing. Homer buys a square watermelon, marvels at it, and then watches in dismay as it turns back into a normal round one and rolls off and smashes, wasting his money. The early jokes poke fun at how high-tech and how expensive everything seems, the kind of teasing a tourist might do about any unfamiliar place. There was even a clever, affectionate joke buried in there. At one point, Marge tries to talk Homer into enjoying the trip by reminding him that he once liked a famous old Japanese film, a movie known for showing the same event remembered in totally different ways by different people. Homer, true to that very idea, grumbles that the movie was not how he remembers it. It was the sort of smart little gag that showed the writers actually knew something about Japanese culture. None of those jokes were the problem. The problem came at the sumo match. Sumo is Japan's old and proud style of heavyweight wrestling, where two very large men wearing simple cloth wraps try to shove each other out of a ring. It is taken seriously and treated with great respect, woven deep into the country's traditions. During the match in the episode, the most important guest in the entire building is there in person, the Emperor of Japan. Now, the Emperor of Japan is not like a president or a mayor. For most of the country's long history, the Emperor was seen as a holy figure, almost like a living god, said by old beliefs to be descended from the heavens themselves. He stood as a sacred symbol for the whole nation, for its history and its people and its very soul. Even in modern times, with his role mostly that of a gentle figurehead, he is treated with enormous respect, and making fun of him is something almost no one in Japan would ever do. To insult the emperor is, in many Japanese eyes, to insult the entire country at once. The show had Homer do exactly that, in the loudest, rudest way it could think up. Homer, being Homer, blunders into the ring and mistakes the small, dignified emperor for an ordinary wrestler. He grabs the elderly ruler, hoists him up over his head, and hurls him into a large bin filled with the dirty, used cloth wraps the sumo wrestlers had been sweating in all day. As he does it, Homer crowns himself with a goofy, made-up title, declaring himself a kind of mighty wrestling monster. So the picture beamed out to the world was of a fat, clueless American cartoon dad tossing Japan's most honored and sacred figure into a heap of soiled underwear. For a country that holds the emperor in such deep regard, there could hardly have been a more shocking or more offensive image. It struck at the one thing the whole nation had quietly agreed should never be touched. The trouble for Homer and Bart continues inside the story. The two of them get arrested for the stunt and thrown into a Japanese jail, where they are made to take part in a very old and very serious style of Japanese theater, acting out a famous tale from Japanese history about a group of loyal warriors who avenged their master. Homer, of course, has no patience for any of it and complains the whole way through, treating a treasured piece of Japanese heritage as a boring chore. Marge eventually pays to get them out, but the cost drains the last of the family's money and leaves them stranded in the country with no way home. To win plane tickets back, the family ends up on a cruel game show that puts them through painful, dangerous stunts for the amusement of a studio audience, hosted by a cheerful man voiced by the well-known actor George Takei. The family suffers their way to freedom and finally makes it home. There was one more piece of the episode that touched a nerve in Japan, separate from the emperor. At one point, the show featured a scene of flashing, blinking cartoon robots that caused the characters watching them to fall into fits and shake on the floor. That bit was a nod to a real and frightening event that had happened in Japan only a couple of years earlier. A flashing scene in a popular Japanese cartoon had actually triggered seizures in hundreds of real Japanese children all watching at the same time, with many of them rushed to the hospital. It had been a genuine national scare, a scary night that Japanese families had not forgotten. By joking about it, the episode brushed up against a painful real-life memory and treated a moment of real fear as a punchline. The episode also tossed in a gag about a factory making a famous cute cartoon cat, and even slipped in quick appearances by Japan's most famous giant movie monsters. Layer by layer, the whole half hour was packed with the kind of jokes about Japanese culture that could land as either playful or mocking, depending on who was watching and how they felt about being the target. When the episode reached the people who decide what airs in Japan, the answer was swift and final. The episode would not be shown. Because of the way it treated the Emperor, 30 Minutes Over Tokyo never played on Japanese television. Not once, not ever. The show's makers did not even prepare a Japanese language version of it the way they did for nearly every other episode. When the 10th season was later sold as a boxed set of discs in Japan, this one episode was quietly left out, snipped from the collection as if it had never been made, leaving Japanese fans with a season that had a hole punched right through the end of it. Years later, when the family's entire library of episodes became available to stream online in Japan, this trip to Tokyo was still missing, still locked away, still treated as something that simply should not exist within the country's borders. Japan was not the only country to slam the door on it. Over in South Korea, a neighboring nation, the episode was also kept off the air, though for a different reason. South Korea and Japan share a long and painful history, with old wounds going back many decades to a time when one country had harshly ruled over the other. Because of that bitter past, an episode stuffed wall to wall with Japanese culture, jokes, and characters was seen as a poor fit for Korean screens, so it was held back there as well. One single episode had now been shut out of two separate countries at the same time, each for reasons rooted deep in that part of the world's history. A cartoon meant as a goofy travel adventure had managed to step on the toes of an entire region. The way Japan handled the whole thing stood in sharp contrast to everything that had come before. The Bush family had fired back with words and feelings. New Orleans had flooded a television station with angry calls and forced a public apology. Brazil had threatened a courtroom and dragged its own president into the argument. Japan did none of that. There was no big public fight, no demand for sorry, no talk of suing anyone, no president going on television. The country simply decided the episode did not deserve to be seen and made it disappear from its screens, calmly and completely, without raising its voice. In some ways, that quiet response was more powerful than any lawsuit. A loud argument fades and people forget what all the shouting was about, but an episode that is never allowed to air is gone for good, at least within that country, locked behind a silence that no apology can ever unlock. The lesson sitting underneath this whole affair was a heavy one. The writers had learned in Brazil that a whole country could take offense as one. In Japan, they learned something sharper. Some things in some places are so deeply respected, so close to the heart of who a people believe themselves to be, that mocking them does not start a debate at all. It just gets the joke erased. The Emperor was untouchable in a way the writers, sitting in their offices in America, had not fully understood until it was far too late. The moment the show touched him anyway, the price was complete silence. No version of that episode would ever flicker across a Japanese living room, not in 1999, not decades later, not for as long as the show kept airing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For all the weight of it, the ban in Japan was still about protecting the honor of a single beloved and sacred man, a matter of deep respect and national pride. Across the sea, another enormous country would also reach out and make a Simpsons episode vanish from its screens. The reason there ran far darker. That country wanted to bury the memory of a terrible day, a day when its own soldiers turned their guns on its own people in the heart of its capital, a day it has spent more than 30 years working hard to pretend never happened at all. And the show had dared to put a sly little reminder of that very day right there on television, hidden cleverly inside a joke. Section 5. The joke China made disappear. Some governments answer a cartoon with angry words. Some answer with threats of a lawsuit. Japan answered by quietly refusing to let an episode air. But in the year 2005, The Simpsons aimed a joke at one of the touchiest subjects on the entire planet. A real and bloody day in Chinese history that the Chinese government has spent decades trying to wipe from memory. The episode was called Goo Goo Gai Pan, and what happened to it years later is one of the strangest and most fitting stories in the whole history of the show. A joke about a government hiding hiding the truth ended up being hidden by a government. The cartoon predicted its own fate without meaning to, as though it had written the ending of its own story years before that ending came true. The story inside the episode starts with Selma, Marge's gravelly voiced sister. Selma has always wanted to be a mother, and she finally decides the way to make it happen is to adopt a baby from China. There is a catch. The adoption people will only hand over a child to a married woman, and Selma is single. So the family cooks up a plan. Homer will pretend to be Selma's husband, and the whole crew will fly to China together to bring the baby home. With that, the Simpsons pack their bags and head off to one of the largest countries on Earth, ready to make their usual mess in a brand new place. Once the family lands in China, the show does what it always does on these trips. It goes sightseeing, and it makes jokes about everything it sees. The family visits famous spots around the capital city of Beijing, taking in the grand sights of one of the oldest civilizations in the world. At one point, they go to look at the preserved body of a long-dead Chinese leader named Mao Zedong, a man who ruled the country for many years and whose body is kept on display in a great hall for crowds to file past and pay their respects. The episode pokes fun at all of it in the usual cheerful, irreverent Simpsons way, treating sacred Chinese landmarks the same way it treats everything else, as a backdrop for gags. None of that was the part that caused the trouble, though. The trouble was packed into one quick sight gag in a famous open plaza called Tiananmen Square. To understand why that one gag was so explosive, the real history behind it has to be told first, because the joke makes no sense without it. Back in 1989, that very plaza, Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing, filled up with huge crowds of people, many of them young students. They had gathered to ask their government for more freedom and a real say in how their country was run. For weeks they camped in the square, peaceful and hopeful, singing and making speeches, drawing the attention of the whole world, which watched and wondered whether China was about to change. Then, in the early summer of that year, the government sent in soldiers and tanks to clear them out by force. The army opened fire on its own people. Many were killed, and many more were arrested and dragged away. To this day, no one knows the true number of the dead, with honest guesses ranging anywhere from several hundred to several thousand lives lost in a single bloody crackdown over just a day or two. There is one image from those days that the whole world remembers, and the episode reached for it directly. The morning after the worst of the killing, a single unarmed man walked out into a wide avenue and stood right in front of a long line of army tanks, refusing to move, blocking their path with nothing but his own body and a couple of shopping bags in his hands. A photograph of that lone man facing down a row of war machines flew around the globe and became one of the most famous pictures ever taken, a symbol of one person's courage against overwhelming force. No one is even sure what became of him afterward. The Simpsons placed a clear nod to that very scene into the cartoon, putting a line of tanks on screen for anyone who knew the history to recognize at once. What the Chinese government did after the killings is the key to the whole joke. Rather than admit what happened, mourn the dead, or allow people to talk about it, the government chose to bury the memory completely. Inside China, talking openly about that day became forbidden. School books leave it out entirely. The internet there scrubs away any mention of it the moment it appears. Young people grow up never being taught that it ever took place, so that millions of Chinese citizens today have genuinely never heard of the thing that the rest of the world watched live. The government's plan, carried out steadily for decades, has been to act as though the killings simply never occurred, to erase a real and bloody event from the memory of an entire nation, one school book and one deleted webpage at a time. That is what makes the Simpsons gag so sharp. When the cartoon family walks through Tiananmen Square, they pass a sign standing in the plaza. The sign reads in plain and simple words that on this very spot in the year 1989, nothing happened. The joke is biting and clever and impossible to misread. The show was openly mocking the Chinese government for pretending the massacre never took place, holding up the official lie and laughing at it right out in the open for the whole world to see. By placing that sign and that line of tanks into the cartoon, the show was telling everyone watching that it remembered exactly what China wanted the world to forget, and that it found the pretending both cowardly and absurd. When the episode first aired in 2005, it played without much fuss in most of the world. The real drama did not arrive until many years later, and it came through a screen almost everyone now uses. In late 2021, the giant entertainment company Disney, which by then owned The Simpsons, launched its streaming service in a city called Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a complicated and important place in this story. For a very long time, it was run by Britain, and even after it was handed back to China in the late 1990s, the people there were promised they could keep many of the freedoms that the rest of China did not have. For years, the people of Hong Kong were able to do something no one on the Chinese mainland could. They could speak openly about the Tiananmen killings. Every single year, on the date of the massacre, massacre, they held an enormous gathering where tens of thousands of people packed into a park and lit candles in the dark to remember the dead, a sea of small flames that went on for decades. There was even a small museum in the city devoted to keeping the memory of that day alive so that no one would be allowed to forget. That freedom began slipping away fast. A powerful new law was placed on Hong Kong in 2020, a law that gave the authorities sweeping power to ban almost anything they claimed might be a danger to the country. Under that law, the yearly candlelight gathering was shut down. The little museum was forced to close after a visit from the police. A famous statue at a local university, built to honor the victims, was taken away. Films and shows could now be blocked if officials decided they crossed the line. The open, free spirit that had once set Hong Kong apart from the rest of China was being squeezed shut year by year, until the things people had done openly for 30 years suddenly became forbidden. So when Disney brought its full library of Simpsons episodes to Hong Kong, sharp-eyed viewers there started looking closely, and they noticed something missing. In the show's 16th season, the list of episodes jumped straight from episode 11 to episode 13. Episode 12, Goo Goo Gai Pan, the one with the Tiananmen sign, was simply gone. It had been quietly plucked out of the lineup, leaving a gap where the China trip should have been. Anyone scrolling through hoping to watch the family help Selma adopt her baby would find nothing there at all, just a number skipped over as if that episode had never been made. Disney never gave a clear public reason for the missing episode. When reporters reached out to ask what happened, the company stayed silent. The Hong Kong office in charge of broadcasting also refused to say anything, so no one knows for certain whether Disney pulled the episode on its own in order to keep the Chinese government happy, or whether the local authorities ordered it taken down. Either way, the result was the same. An episode that made fun of a government for hiding the truth had itself been hidden, and the people most likely to understand the joke, the very people of Hong Kong who had spent years lighting candles for the dead, were the ones now blocked from watching it. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. There was one small crack in the wall, though. Clever viewers found that by using special tools to disguise where their computers were, they could still sneak around the block and watch the missing episode anyway. The show had been hidden, but it was not gone forever. Not as long as people kept finding ways to reach it. For most shows, one disappearing episode would be the end of the tale. The Simpsons managed to do it twice. A little over a year after the first episode vanished, in early 2023, people noticed that a second Simpsons episode had also gone missing from the service in Hong Kong. This one was much newer, from the show's 34th season, and it carried the title One Angry Lisa. The reason it got pulled was a single line of dialogue. In one scene, Marge looks out at the country and rattles off a cheerful list of the so-called wonders of China. Tucked into that list, right between other things, she mentions forced labor camps where children make smartphones. Forced labor camps are places where people are made to work against their will, with no freedom to leave. The line was a pointed jab at real accusations that have been made against China, claims that some of the goods sold around the world are built by people who are being forced to make them, against their will and without fair pay. The Chinese government has always firmly denied that any such thing happens. That one quick joke, just a handful of words, was apparently enough to make the whole episode disappear, just like the first one had. A respected news organization was the one to spot it and report it to the world. By now, a clear pattern had formed, and it pointed at something bigger than a couple of cartoon jokes. Disney, the company that owned the show, is one of the largest entertainment businesses on the planet, and China is one of the largest markets on the planet, packed with well over 1 billion possible customers. Selling movies, shows, toys, and theme park tickets to that enormous audience is worth a staggering amount of money, more than almost any other prize in the entertainment world. Keeping the Chinese government pleased, then, became very important to companies hoping to do business there, because a single misstep could see their films blocked and their profits vanish. The two missing Simpsons episodes were only part of a larger story of big companies bending and trimming and quietly editing their work to avoid upsetting China. There were other examples around the same time. A big Disney movie ran into heavy criticism for being filmed in a part of China known for the serious mistreatment of the people who live there. Another Disney movie was spotted carrying a small hidden detail, a string of numbers, that pointed quietly at the very date of the Tiananmen killings, sparking its own round of grumbling about what it might mean. Piece by piece, the picture came together. A company that wanted to keep selling to China seemed willing to make its art a little smaller, a little quieter, bitter and a little less honest in order to get there. Looking back across all the trouble the show had caused so far, China marked the darkest and most serious turn yet. The fight with the Bush family had been a personal squabble, almost playful. New Orleans had been wounded pride over a cruel song, healed with a parade. Brazil had been hurt feelings over a bad vacation, soothed with an apology and a joke. Japan had been about guarding the honor of one beloved and sacred man. China was something else entirely. This was about a government working to erase the memory of a day when its own soldiers had killed its own people, and a global company seemingly agreeing to help keep that memory buried in exchange for the chance to do business in a rich market. The show had not insulted a city or mocked a leader's pride. It had told an uncomfortable truth, said the thing out loud that a powerful nation had ordered everyone to never say, and that truth was powerful enough that it kept getting switched off. There is a heavy lesson sitting at the center of all this. A joke can be more dangerous than an insult. An insult only stings someone's feelings, and feelings heal with time. A joke that points at a hidden truth, that drags into the light the very thing a powerful government has spent decades burying, becomes a threat all on its own, because it does the one thing the government cannot allow. It makes people remember. The Chinese government did not seem to mind being mocked nearly as much as it minded being reminded. And so the safest thing to do, from the point of view of those in charge, was to make sure the reminder never reached the screen at all. 2 episodes, years apart, both quietly deleted, both carrying the very same crime of remembering what others wished forgotten. A cartoon had stumbled onto a real power, the power to keep a memory alive, and a government had answered that power the only way it knew how, by trying to switch the cartoon off. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every battle the show had fought up to this point had been waged against outsiders, governments and groups reaching across oceans to silence an episode long after it first aired. The next great fight began somewhere far closer to home, and it began before the episode in question ever reached a single living room. The show's own network, the very company that paid for the show and put it on the air, took one look at a finished episode and declared it unfit to ever be seen by anyone. The thing that frightened those powerful people so badly was not a massacre or an emperor or an angry foreign nation. It was simply a kind, cheerful man who happened to be gay, and a quiet little story brave enough to treat him as nothing out of the ordinary at all. Section 6. The episode Fox tried to bury before anyone saw it. Up to this point, every fight over a Simpsons episode had come from somewhere far away. A foreign government, an angry city, an upset president. But in the winter of 1997, in the middle of what many fans call the show's greatest years, the most surprising battle of all broke out. This time, the people trying to stop an episode were not strangers across an ocean. They were the show's own bosses, the very network that paid for the show and put it on the air. And they made their move before a single family ever got to watch it. The episode was called Homer's Phobia, a clever twist on the word homophobia, which means a fear or hatred of gay people. The whole story of how it nearly never aired is one of the proudest chapters the show ever had. The idea for the episode came together from 2 smaller scraps that the writers had been kicking around. One of the writers had floated a rough, blunt notion about giving Bart a storyline tied to being gay, tossed out in the loose, joking way that ideas often get pitched in a writer's room. Around the same time, the people running the show had been toying with a separate idea about Lisa discovering a love for old, campy, over-the-top things. The kind of cheesy junk that is so tacky, it loops back around to being wonderful. Those 2 thoughts got stitched together and reshaped, and out of that stitching came a far richer story than either piece had been on its own. What started as a couple of half-formed jokes grew into a thoughtful, warm-hearted episode about fear, family, and acceptance. The episode itself begins with the kind of small money problem the show loved. Bart accidentally damages a pipe in the house, and the family is suddenly stuck needing about $900 to fix it. To raise the cash, Marge digs out an old family keepsake and decides to sell it. She takes it to a little shop crammed full of funny old odds and ends, the kind of place that sells goofy lamps and strange knickknacks from years gone by. The shop is run by a warm, friendly, funny man named John, and right away the whole family takes a liking to him. John is voiced by a real-life film director named John Waters, a man famous for making strange, campy, offbeat movies that built up a devoted following over the years. Waters is openly gay himself, and his cheerful, knowing sense of humor poured straight into the character, giving John a charm that made him instantly easy to love. Homer in particular becomes fast friends with John. The 2 of them hit it off, laughing and joking and enjoying each other's company. Homer thinks John is just about the most fun new pal he has made in ages. Then Marge gently points out something Homer had not picked up on. John is gay. The moment Homer learns this, his happy friendship curdles into panic. All his warm feelings vanish, replaced by a silly, fearful idea lodged deep in his head. Homer becomes terrified that simply being around John will somehow rub off on his son, that Bart might catch being gay the way a person catches a cold, and that John will turn the boy into something Homer does not understand. From there, the episode follows Homer's clumsy, panicked attempts to make Bart into his idea of a tough, manly boy. He frets over little things, like Bart wearing a loud flowered shirt or dancing around in a wig, reading each one as a warning sign. To fix what he imagines is a problem, Homer drags Bart along on a series of plans meant to toughen him up. At one point, he plants the boy in front of a giant billboard showing a woman, hoping to steer Bart's tastes in the direction Homer wants, only for the plan to backfire in embarrassing fashion. In another famous part, Homer takes Bart to a steel mill, a hot, loud factory where they make metal, figuring it will surround the boy with rugged, hard-working men. The plan falls apart in the funniest way possible. When the end of shift whistle blows, the entire factory full of burly workers drops its tools and turns the place into a bright, pumping dance party, complete with flashing lights, because the workers there are gay too. Homer's desperate search for a manly example keeps leading him straight to the very thing he is running from, and the harder he tries to escape it, the more it surrounds him. Homer's panic finally reaches its peak when he decides the surefire way to make Bart manly is to take him hunting. The trip goes about as badly as a trip can go. Out in the cold alongside his buddies, Homer leads Bart into a snowy spot full of reindeer, and the hunt turns dangerous fast when the animals stop being scared and start being angry. Homer and Bart end up cornered and in real trouble, with the reindeer closing in. The person who comes to the rescue is none other than John, the gay friend Homer had pushed away. John saves the day, using a clever trick with a mechanical Santa Claus to scare off the animals and pull Homer and Bart out of harm's way. In that moment, Homer's silly fears finally melt. He sees that John is a good and loyal friend, the kind who shows up when it matters most, braver and truer than any of the so-called manly company Homer had been chasing. By the end, Homer not only accepts John, he turns to Bart and tells the boy that he loves him no matter who he turns out to be. The whole story, underneath the jokes, is about a frightened father learning to let go of his fear and love his child without conditions. That gentle, big-hearted message is exactly what makes the next part of the story so strange. When the script was sent off to the people at the Fox network, whose job is to decide what is allowed on television, the show's writers expected the usual routine. Normally, those notes came back short and small. A typical note might suggest swapping one rude word for a softer one, the kind of tiny change the writers barely noticed. That was the rhythm they were used to, episode after episode, year after year. This time, what came back was nothing like the usual. The notes ran on for page after page, several pages thick, and they picked at nearly every single line in the whole episode that had anything to do with being gay. The people reviewing it did not want the word gay used. They did not want the subject discussed at all. And at the very bottom of all those pages of complaints came the line that stopped everyone cold. The note declared that the entire subject and the entire content of the episode were unacceptable to put on the air. The network was not asking for a few trims here and there. It was rejecting the whole thing, top to bottom, start to finish. That left the writers in a spot they had never faced before. Usually, when the network flagged a few lines, the team could simply fix those exact bits later, after the episode came back from being drawn, swapping out a word or shaving down a joke. But there was no way to fix this episode that way, because the network had not pointed at a handful of lines, it had pointed at everything. The whole story was the problem in the eyes of the censors, and a person cannot trim away the whole story and still have an episode left. The team had built something the network simply did not want to exist at all. Faced with that wall, the writers did something thoughtful. They wanted to make sure the episode would treat gay people with respect and not cause real hurt, so they turned to the one person on the project who could speak to that directly, the gay film director voicing John. They asked John Waters straight out whether he thought gay viewers would find the episode offensive. His answer was reassuring. He had only one real objection. The script had used a harsh, ugly word to insult John's character at one point, and Waters felt that word should go. The writers agreed at once and swapped it for a softer one. Beyond that single change, Waters had no problem with the episode at all. The man whose community the story was about had given it his blessing. Then came the lucky break that saved the whole thing. Making an episode of The Simpsons takes a long time, and a big part of the work, the actual drawing of all the pictures, was done far away in another country before the finished episode came back home. While the episode was off being drawn overseas, big changes swept through the Fox network. The person running running the network at the time was pushed out, and a shakeup followed that swept away staff, including the very people who had rejected the episode so harshly. By the time the finished animated episode landed back on a desk for one more look, a whole new set of eyes was doing the looking. Eyes that knew nothing of the angry pages that had come before. The writers held their breath and sent it through again. The note that came back this time was as short as could be. It simply said the episode was acceptable to broadcast. The wall had crumbled, not because anyone won an argument, but because the people who built the wall were gone. So in February of 1997, Homer's Phobia finally aired, the first Simpsons episode ever built entirely around a gay character and gay themes. The reward for all that struggle was sweet. The episode did not just survive, it triumphed. It went on to win one of television's top honors, an Emmy Award, for being the best animated program. It also won a special award from a group that celebrates fair and kind portrayals of gay people in the media, honoring the episode as an outstanding piece of television. To this day, it sits near the top of nearly every list of the show's finest episodes. The very story that the network had branded unfit for any screen ended up being praised year after year as one of the finest, most warm-hearted things the show had ever produced. John Waters summed up the whole spirit of it with a simple line that has stuck around ever since. He said he had always believed the only way to change a person's opinion is to make them laugh first. That was the secret weapon of the whole episode. By wrapping its kindness inside jokes, by letting people laugh along with Homer's silly panic before quietly showing how foolish that panic was, the show slipped a gentle lesson past offenses that a lecture never could have reached. Homer's Phobia did not wag a finger at anyone. It just made them laugh, and then it made them think. And that turned out to be a far more powerful trick than any speech. The show kept walking through the door this episode had opened. In the years that followed, The Simpsons brought more gay characters into the light and treated them as a normal part of life in Springfield. Marge's tough-talking sister Patty later came out as a lesbian in an episode of her own. Mr. Burns' loyal, lovesick helper Smithers, whose feelings for his boss had been a quiet joke for years, finally came out openly in a later season. Each of those moments stood on the foundation that Homer's Phobia had laid down back in 1997. The episode the network tried to bury turned out to be a beginning, not an ending. There is something worth sitting with in how different this fight was from all the ones before it. The trouble in Brazil and Japan and China had come from the outside, from powerful strangers trying to silence the show after the fact. This battle came from within the show's own home, from the hands that fed it, and it was fought before the episode had reached anyone at all. And the thing those powerful insiders found so dangerous, so unfit for television, was the smallest and kindest thing imaginable. A friendly man, a loving father, a simple message that people deserve to be accepted for who they are. The show had been threatened over insulting an emperor and mocking a massacre, and now it had nearly been stopped cold over a story whose whole point was tenderness. Sometimes the bravest thing a show can do is refuse to be ashamed of kindness. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The wind felt clean and good, and the show came out of it standing taller than before. Years down the road, though, a very different kind of storm would gather, and this one would not blow over in a matter of weeks. It would build slowly, over a long stretch of time, around a single character the show had always treated as good, clean fun. A cheerful shopkeeper with a thick accent and a big smile. A whole group of real people would step forward to say that this beloved cartoon had quietly taught the rest of the world to laugh at them. And in the end, the very man who had given that character his voice for nearly 30 years would stand up in front of everyone and say he was sorry he had ever done it. Section 7. The friendly shopkeeper who caused a reckoning. Not every fight the show faced arrived with a bang. Some arrived slowly, building quietly over many years until they could no longer be ignored. The trouble over a character named Apu was exactly that kind of slow storm. There was no single offensive episode to point at, no angry phone call, no banned broadcast. Instead, there was one beloved cartoon character, on the show since almost the very beginning, who came to stand for a much bigger and more painful question. Could something that millions of people had laughed at for decades have been hurting real people the whole time without anyone in charge stopping to notice? The answer the world eventually arrived at would push the show to quietly retire one of its most famous faces, and would lead the man who voiced him to apologize again and again for ever having done so. Apu had been part of Springfield since the show's first year on the air, back in 1990. He ran the local convenience store, the little corner shop where the townsfolk grabbed their snacks and drinks and lottery tickets. Apu was an immigrant from India, hardworking and clever, often shown putting in endless hours behind the counter without a single day off. He had a cheerful goodbye he gave forgave every customer, thanking them and inviting them to come again, a line that became one of the most quoted bits in the whole show. What many people forget is just how accomplished the character was written to be. The show gave Apu a backstory that made him one of the smartest people in all of Springfield. He had come to America as a graduate student, earned an advanced degree in computer science, and was, on paper, far better educated than nearly everyone else in town, including his own customers. He spoke several languages and could outthink most of the people he served. Over the years, the show built him a full and busy life beyond the shop. He was handed a wedding to a wife named Manjula, arranged in the traditional way by their families, and later a house full of 8 babies all born at once, a wild storyline that gave him one of the largest families in the entire show. For a long time, fans simply adored him. He was one of the most recognizable members of the huge Springfield cast, and to many viewers, he seemed like a fully drawn, dignified person rather than a flat joke. There was a catch hiding inside all of that though, and it sat at the very center of the character. Apu spoke with a thick, heavy Indian accent, and much of the comedy around him leaned on that accent and on big, exaggerated mannerisms. And the voice behind Apu did not belong to an Indian actor at all. It belonged to Hank Azaria, one of the show's main voice actors, a white American man. For years, Azaria had performed Apu by putting on an accent meant to sound Indian, a voice he himself would later admit was based on a cartoonish, mocking impression rather than anything real. Millions of people heard that voice every week and laughed, and for a long time, almost no one in the spotlight stopped to ask whether the people actually being imitated found it funny. The clever backstory and the advanced degree did not seem to matter much out in the wider world. What stuck in people's minds was the accent and the catchphrase. Those people had a great deal to say once they finally got the chance. In 2017, an Indian-American comedian named Hari Kondabolu put out a film, the kind that looks closely at something real, and he aimed it squarely at this one cartoon character. He called it The Problem with Apu. In the film, Kondabolu gathered up a striking lineup of well-known South Asian actors, comedians, and writers, many of them famous faces in their own right, and let them speak about what this single cartoon had done to their lives. One after another, these successful performers described the same wound. They laid out a case that had been building in many hearts for years. They argued that Apu was a stereotype, which is a flat, cookie-cutter picture that crams a whole group of different people into one narrow, silly idea. According to Kondabolu and the many South Asian people who spoke in the film, Apu had taught much of America to see Indian people as nothing more than funny shopkeepers with goofy accents. The film did something powerful. It moved the conversation out of the cartoon and into real life. People who had grown up Indian or South Asian in America came forward to describe what it had been like to live alongside Apu. Children had been taunted on playgrounds, with other kids throwing Apu's accent and his catchphrase in their faces to mock them. Grown-ups had heard the same impression hurled at them from car windows and store counters, even after they had become doctors, lawyers, and stars. For these people, Apu had never been a harmless joke. He had been a weapon that others picked up and used against them, over and over, for years. A cartoon that the writers had built for laughs had slipped out into the world and become a tool for cruelty, whether the writers ever meant it to or not. The film stirred up a fierce debate, and, to be fair, there were thoughtful voices on more than one side of it. Some people, including a number of Indian fans, pushed back against the idea of getting rid of Apu altogether. They pointed out that for a very long time, Apu had been one of the only Indian characters anywhere on American television. In an era when people from that part of the world were almost invisible on screen, here at least was an Indian character who was smart, hardworking, central to a hugely popular show, and given real storylines and a real family. To lose him entirely, some argued, would simply swap one problem for another, trading a flawed bit of representation for no representation at all. That argument did not erase the pain others described, but it showed that the question was a genuinely hard one, with decent people landing in different places. When the film whipped up a national conversation, all eyes turned to The Simpsons, waiting to see how the show would answer. The response, when it came in 2018, landed badly. Rather than meet the criticism head-on, the show slipped a reply into an episode in a way that struck many people as dismissive and cold. In the scene, Lisa, usually the show's most thoughtful and caring voice, turned and spoke almost directly out toward the audience. She remarked that something which had begun long ago, something once praised and once seen as perfectly harmless, was now branded as wrong, and she wondered aloud what a person was even supposed to do about that. As she spoke, the camera drifted to a framed photo of Apu sitting nearby. Marge added that some things would be dealt with at a later time, and Lisa replied that perhaps they never would be. The whole moment came across as a shrug, as if the show were brushing off the very real pain people had just finished describing. The man who made the film said the reply left him genuinely sad and let down. Many viewers felt the same. The show's attempt to wave away the problem only made the problem louder. The most interesting and most human part of this whole story belongs to Hank Azaria, the man behind the voice. His journey from where he started to where he ended up did not happen overnight, and he never pretended that it did. At first, like a lot of people, Azaria felt torn and a little defensive. Part of him bristled at the idea of giving in to public pressure, of being told what he could and could not do by angry voices online. Yet another part of him could not shake the feeling that the criticism was landing on something true. Rather than dig in or wave it away, Azaria did something that takes real humility. He went and listened. He took the time to sit down with people, to attend gatherings and sessions where he could hear directly from those who had been hurt, soaking in their stories rather than rushing to defend himself. He has been open about that struggle, admitting that before the film came out, he had honestly never once stopped to think about the harm the character might cause. He said it took being told the same thing over and over, dozens of times, before the message finally sank all the way in. To his credit, once it did sink in, he did not run from it. In 2018, Azaria went on a late-night television talk show and spoke about the controversy in public for the first time in a serious way. He said plainly that he was perfectly willing to step aside from the role. He went further than just offering to quit. He said he wanted the show to bring real Indian and South Asian writers into the room where the stories were made, not as a token gesture, but as true voices helping decide what should happen to the character and how or whether he should be voiced at all. Azaria was no longer defending himself. He was handing over the floor to the people who had been hurt and asking them to lead. Then, in 2020, Azaria made it official. He announced that he would stop voicing Apu for good. He did not stop there either. He stepped away from voicing several other characters of color on the show as well, explaining that even where no one had complained, it no longer sat right with him for a white actor to take those roles when actors of color had so few chances of their own. He said the fair thing, the decent thing, was to step back and let those opportunities go to the people they truly belonged to. The show, for its part, did not hand Apu to a new actor. Instead, the character simply faded into the background, still appearing now and then in a crowd, but speaking little or not at all. A quiet retirement for a once loud and central figure. Azaria's apologies kept coming, and they grew deeper with time. On one popular talk show, he said he was sorry for his part in creating the character, and for taking part in the harm it caused. He confessed that part of him felt he ought to go and personally apologize to every single Indian person in the entire country, one by one, for what he had helped put into the world. These were not the careful, lawyer-written words of someone trying to dodge blame. They were the words of a man who had genuinely come to understand that he had done something hurtful and who felt the weight of it pressing on him. The most striking moment of all came in 2023, when Azaria finally sat down face to face with Hari Kondabolu, the man whose film had started the whole reckoning. The two of them talked openly in public for the first time. Azaria admitted in clear and unsparing words that through Apu he had helped create a picture that stripped away the dignity of an entire group of people and made them seem less than fully human. He shared the moment that had cut through all his defensiveness for good. He had read a news story about a real store clerk who had been attacked, and the person attacking him had screamed the name Apu at him as an insult while doing it. Hearing that, Azaria realized that the cheerful cartoon name he had voiced for nearly 30 years had curdled into a slur, which is a cruel word used to put down and wound a whole group of people. Once a name from a comedy becomes the word a person spits while hurting someone, the joke is over. Azaria understood that, and he could not unknow it. What makes the Apu story sit so differently from the others is where the trouble came from. The fight over the gay character in Homer's phobia had pitted the writers against their own bosses, and the writers had been the brave ones, pushing a kind story past frightened gatekeepers. The trouble over Apu pointed the other way. This time, the show itself was the one being asked to look in the mirror, and the people doing the asking were not foreign governments or network bosses. They were ordinary people, members of the audience, who had loved the show and grown up with it, and yet had been quietly wounded by it the entire time. There was no villain to fight here, no censor to outsmart. There was only the slow, uncomfortable work of admitting that something made with no cruel intent percent had still done real harm. The whole affair left a lasting mark on how the show, and how television in general, thought about who gets to voice whom. After Azaria stepped down, the idea that an actor of one background should not put on a mocking voice to play someone of another background spread quickly across the world of cartoons. Many other shows made similar changes around the same time, with white actors stepping aside from characters of color so that those roles could finally go to the people they were meant to represent. A single convenience store owner in a made-up town had helped shift an entire industry. Apu had started as a punchline, become a beloved fixture, turned into a source of real pain, and ended as the reason a whole way of doing things finally changed. There is a gentle truth tucked inside this story, and it is a hard one for anyone to swallow. A thing can be made with a smile, loved by millions, and still cause damage that its makers never saw coming. Good intentions do not erase real harm, and the people best placed to spot that harm are usually the ones living on the receiving end of it. The show took years and a great deal of stubbornness to finally hear what those people were saying. The man who voiced Apu took years too, but in the end he listened, and he owned what he had done, fully and without excuses. That kind of honest reckoning is rare, and it is worth respecting wherever it appears. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Apu showed how a beloved piece of the show could be quietly set aside once the world began looking at it through new eyes. There was one episode though that did not get quietly set aside, or trimmed, or argued over for years. It was erased completely, scrubbed away so thoroughly that today, it stands as the single hardest Simpsons episode on the entire planet to find. The reason behind its disappearance had almost nothing to do with the cartoon family at all. It had everything to do with a wildly famous real-life singer who secretly lent his voice to the show, and with the dark and disturbing truth about that man that the whole world was finally forced to face, many years after the episode first aired. Section 8. The episode the show erased from history. Every episode of The Simpsons can be found somewhere if a person looks hard enough. Every single one, save for a single exception. There is exactly one episode that the people who own the show have chosen to wipe away on purpose, pulling it from every streaming service, every rerun, and every new disc set until it has become a kind of ghost. It is the rarest Simpsons episode on Earth, and finding it legally now requires hunting down an old box of discs that stopped being made years ago. The episode is called Stark Raving Dad, and the strange and sad story of why it was erased has almost nothing to do with the cartoon itself. It has everything to do with a secret hidden inside it, and a real-life horror that came to light decades after it first aired. The episode opened the show's third season back in 1991, and on its own terms, it is a sweet and gentle story. The trouble starts with a simple laundry mishap. Bart accidentally tosses a red hat in with the wash, and all of Homer's white work shirts come out a soft shade of pink. Homer, having no other choice, wears a pink shirt to the power plant. Between the odd shirt and a stressful day, Homer ends up rushing through a quick written test meant to measure whether a person is stable, scribbling down wild answers without thinking. Based on that test, the people in charge decide Homer might be dangerous, and he gets shipped off to a mental hospital for observation. Inside the hospital, Homer meets the heart of the whole episode. He befriends a large, gentle white man named Leon Kompowski, who is convinced, deep down in his soul, that he is the superstar singer Michael Jackson. Leon talks in Michael Jackson's soft, breathy voice, moves like him, and carries himself like the most famous pop star in the world. Homer, never the sharpest tool in the shed, believes him completely. When Homer is finally released, he invites his new friend, the man he is sure is the real Michael Jackson, to come stay at the family home. Word spreads through Springfield like wildfire, and soon the whole town is buzzing with excitement that the King of Pop is paying them a visit. A tender little side story runs alongside all of this. It is Lisa's birthday, and Bart, as usual, has completely forgotten to get his sister a present. Desperate to make it up to her, Bart promises Lisa a song, though he has no idea how to write one. The man everyone believes is Michael Jackson steps in to help. Together, the two of them craft a heartfelt birthday song just for Lisa, a warm and simple tune wishing her a happy birthday. The moment lands with real feeling, the kind of quiet sweetness the show was so good at hiding inside its silliness. At the very end, Leon drops the act and reveals his true, ordinary voice. He is not Michael Jackson at all, just a kind-hearted bricklayer who had taken on the singer's persona for reasons of his own. He thanks the family and goes on his way, leaving everyone a little better for having known him. Here is the secret that made the episode legendary among fans for years. The man who voiced Leon, the patient who believed he was Michael Jackson, actually was Michael Jackson. The real King of Pop, one of the most famous human beings alive at the time, was a huge fan of The Simpsons and wanted to appear on it, so he secretly recorded recorded the speaking voice for the character himself. Because of a deal he had with his record company, he was not allowed to be credited or to do the actual singing, so the show listed him in the credits under a made-up fake name, and a different singer who sounded just like him handled the songs. For years, knowing that the real Michael Jackson had quietly slipped into an episode of The Simpsons in disguise was one of the most delightful pieces of trivia a fan could share. It made the episode feel like a hidden treasure. There is one more detail that ties this episode back to the very beginning of this whole story. Stark Raving Dead is the exact same episode that the writers later used to fire back at President George Bush. When Bush gave his speech wishing American families were more like the wholesome Waltons and less like the Simpsons, the writers added a brand new opening to a rerun of this episode, the bit where Bart turns to the president on the television and says the family is just like the Waltons, since both are praying for an end to hard times. So the single episode that the show would one day erase from history is also the one that carried one of its proudest, cleverest jabs at the most powerful man in the country. A strange fate for one little half hour of cartoon. For nearly 30 years, the episode lived happily in reruns and on discs, beloved and untroubled. Then, in 2019, everything changed. A documentary came out, the kind of film that digs into something real, and it turned the whole world's view of Michael Jackson upside down. In the film, two grown men spoke at length about their childhoods, telling deeply disturbing stories of being abused by the singer when they were young boys. The accusations were graphic, detailed, and devastating, and the film reached an enormous audience. While Michael Jackson had faced whispers and accusations during his life, this documentary brought the darkest claims about him roaring back into the public eye with a force that could not be ignored. People everywhere were forced to wrestle with the legacy of a man whose music they had grown up loving. That reckoning landed squarely on The Simpsons because of the secret tucked inside Stark Raving Dead. The whole episode hinges on Homer befriending a man he believes to be Michael Jackson, with the real Jackson's voice woven right into it. In light of the terrible allegations, the people running the show looked at the episode and felt they could no longer keep it in front of audiences. So they made a decision that the show had never made before and has never made since. They pulled Stark Raving Dad from existence entirely. They yanked it from streaming so that today it is the one and only episode missing from the show's otherwise complete online collection. They cut it from reruns, they removed it from future disc sets. An episode that millions had watched and loved simply vanished, on purpose, by the choice of the people who created it. The man who made the call was James L. Brooks, the same producer who had smoothed over the fights with Brazil and the Bush family years before. He explained the choice in a way that has stuck with people ever since. Brooks said the decision felt like clearly the only choice the show could make. He admitted he hated the idea of destroying creative work of any kind, comparing it to the ugly act of burning books, which he said he was firmly against. But then he offered a thought that settled the matter for him. He pointed out that this particular episode was their own creation, their own book in a sense, and that the people who wrote a book are allowed to tear out a single chapter from it if they choose. They were not censoring someone else's work. They were quietly removing one chapter of their own, the one chapter that had become impossible to enjoy. The decision did not sit easily with everyone, and an honest look at the story has to admit that. Some fans and thinkers pushed back, raising a question that has no clean answer. The episode itself, after all, is innocent. It contains nothing about the allegations, nothing dark, nothing harmful. Michael Jackson's involvement was hidden under a fake name, and the story is simply a gentle one about kindness and a little girl's birthday song. So a fair question hangs over the whole thing. When a creative work is touched by the crimes of someone connected to it, is it right to erase the work, or does that punish a piece of art for sins it did not commit? People of good conscience landed on different sides of that question. Some felt the show did the decent thing by refusing to keep platforming the voice of an accused abuser. Others felt that erasing a beloved episode accomplished little beyond depriving fans of something they cherished, since the man himself was already gone. The debate echoed the very same kind of argument that had swirled around Apu, the tug of war between the thing that was made and the people tangled up in its making. What makes this story stand apart from all the others is the completeness of the erasure. New Orleans got an apology. Brazil got a cheeky joke. The gay episode survived its near death and went on to win awards. Even the episode's block in Japan and China still exists somewhere, sitting quietly in vaults, watchable by anyone clever enough to find a way around the block. Stark Raving Dad is different in kind. The show did not just hide it from one country or trim a single line. The show reached back into its own past and pulled the episode out by the roots, declaring that it should no longer be part of the collection at all. It is the only time the creators ever looked at their own finished work and decided the world would be better off without it. There is a quiet sadness running through the whole affair. An episode built on warmth, on the simple joy of a stranger helping a boy write a birthday song for his sister, together became forever stained by a darkness no one watching in 1991 could have imagined. The kindness of the story did not save it. The cleverness of its hidden secret, once a source of pure delight, turned into the exact reason it had to disappear. The very thing that had made the episode special, the secret voice of a global superstar, became the poison that killed it. A treasure turned into something the show could not bear to keep. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Michael Jackson episode was erased because of the dark deeds of one famous man, a chapter the show chose to tear out of its own book. There was another Simpsons episode, though, that vanished from television screens for a reason that had nothing to do with anyone doing anything wrong. This other episode had committed no sin at all. It was funny, it was clever, and audiences had genuinely loved it. Then, on one bright and ordinary morning, a real-life horror tore through a real American city, and almost overnight, a harmless cartoon turned into something far too painful for anyone to sit and watch. The show had set a long, central stretch of that episode in a place that, after that terrible morning, the entire world would spend years mourning. Section 9. The episode a tragedy took off the air. Some episodes were pulled because people were angry. Some were erased because of the crimes of those connected to them. But one of the most beloved episodes the show ever made was quietly taken off the air for a reason that had nothing to do with anger or wrongdoing of any kind. It was set aside out of pure grief. The episode itself was funny, clever, and adored by fans. It had broken no rules and insulted no one. Then a real-life tragedy struck a real American city, and almost overnight, a harmless cartoon became something far too painful for anyone to watch. The episode was called The City of New York vs. Homer Simpson, and its story is one of the gentlest and saddest in the show's long history. The episode kicked off the show's 9th season in 1997, near the tail end of the years that fans treasure most. The setup is classic Simpsons mischief. After a night out, Homer's lovable drunk friend Barney borrows the family car and drives it all the way to New York City, where he abandons it. The car does not just get left anywhere either. Barney parks it smack in the middle of the plaza at the foot of the World Trade Center, the famous pair of enormous towers that once stood tall over downtown New York. Weeks later, the family receives a stern letter from the city. Their car has been sitting illegally between the towers, piling up parking tickets and locked in place by a heavy metal clamp on its wheel. If they do not come retrieve it within 3 days, the letter warns, the car will be destroyed. Homer wants nothing to do with the trip. He carries a deep grudge against New York thanks to a miserable experience he had there back in the 1970s, and the very thought of returning fills him with dread. The rest of the family outvotes him though, and so the Simpsons pile onto a cheap bus and make the long ride to the city. Once they arrive, the family splits up. Marge and the kids set off to see the sights and enjoy everything New York has to offer, while Homer is left behind to guard the car and wait for a city worker to come unlock the wheel clamp. The worker, Homer is told, might show up any time within a long stretch of hours, so Homer is stuck standing around for what feels like forever. A good chunk of the episode unfolds right there at the base of the two towers. While he waits, Homer grows more and more desperate, and at one point he is struck by an urgent need to find a bathroom. He is told the restroom is at the top of one of the towers, so up he goes, only to be told it is actually in the other tower. Homer ends up dashing back and forth between the two giant buildings, racing across the plaza in a frantic, funny scramble. He also samples some strange New York street food and an odd drink, and the city around him bustles with life. A big, splashy musical number plays out during his ordeal, a goofy song that pokes fun at the kind of grand productions the city is known for. Eventually, Homer's patience snaps completely, and in true Homer fashion, he tries to drive the car away with the clamp still locked onto the wheel, causing a wild burst of chaos before the family finally escapes the city. What is worth noticing here is how much love and care the show poured into drawing the towers and the plaza around them. This was the heart of the episode's look. One of the show's top artists actually traveled to New York in person to study the real World Trade Center, walking the plaza, taking in the details, and bringing all of it home so the team could recreate the spot as faithfully as possible. The colors, the layout, the feel of standing at the base of those two towers, all of it was rendered with real attention. The result was an episode that did not just mention the World Trade Center in passing. It planted an entire long stretch of the story right there, turning the towers into a kind of co-star. For 1997, it was a warm, affectionate cartoon postcard of one of the most famous places in America. There is one detail buried in the episode that, looking back, sends a genuine chill down the spine. At one point, a travel pamphlet appears on screen advertising cheap trips to New York. The price printed on it is $9, and the way the show drew it, the number 9 sits right in front of the two towers. To anyone watching years later, that little image looks unsettling unsettlingly like the date that would come to stand for one of the darkest days in the country's history, the 11th day of the 9th month. It was nothing more than a strange and unlucky accident. The writers had simply picked $9 as a silly, cartoonishly cheap price for a trip. One of the people who worked on the show later admitted that the coincidence was downright eerie, all the more so because this happened to be the one episode of any television series ever made that built an entire section of its story around jokes set at the World Trade Center. No one could have known. No one could have guessed. Then came the morning that changed everything. On the 11th of September in the year 2001, attackers hijacked passenger planes and deliberately crashed two of them into the twin towers of the World Trade Center. Both towers collapsed. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives that day in one of the most devastating attacks ever to strike the country. The whole world watched in horror as the towers that had stood over New York for decades came crashing down. The plaza that the Simpsons artist had once strolled through and lovingly recreated, the very ground where Homer had waited by his clamped car, was gone, buried under rubble and grief. In a single morning, the World Trade Center went from a proud landmark to the site of an unspeakable loss. Suddenly, the episode became impossible to air. An entire long section of it was set at the foot of the towers, packed with cheerful jokes about the place. Homer dashing between the two buildings in search of a bathroom, the car parked in the shadow of the towers, the whole sunny cartoon vision of the World Trade Center as a backdrop for comedy. After what had happened, none of it could be played for laughs anymore. What had once been a fond, funny tribute to a beloved landmark had turned, through no fault of its own, into a source of fresh pain. The local channels across much of the country that aired the show's reruns quietly took this episode out of the rotation. They simply stopped showing it. There was no big announcement, no loud debate. The episode just gently slipped out of sight, set down with care, the way people lower their voices near something sacred. The way this removal worked stood in sharp contrast to the Michael Jackson episode. That one had been torn out by the roots and erased forever, because the reason behind it never softened with time. The New York episode was handled differently. It was not destroyed or condemned, it was simply rested, allowed to sit quietly out of view while a wounded nation healed. And as the years passed and the rawest part of the grief slowly faded, the episode was carefully brought back. By around 2006, roughly 5 years after the attacks, it had returned to the reruns, allowed to air once more for audiences who could finally watch it again. The episode had not changed a single frame in all that time. The world around it had changed instead, and then, slowly, the world made room for it again. This whole chapter set a kind of quiet rule that the show would lean on in the years to come. Whenever a real disaster struck somewhere in the world, the people in charge learned to pause and look at their own library with fresh, careful eyes, asking whether any old episode might suddenly cut too close to fresh pain. That very thing happened again years later, when a terrible earthquake and the disaster that followed devastated parts of Japan. With the wreckage of a damaged nuclear power station all over the news, the show, which is built around a family man who works at a nuclear plant, took a careful look at its episodes. The network handed local stations a list of episodes that might feel too sensitive given the suffering in Japan, so each station could decide for itself whether to hold them back. One of the show's leaders pointed straight back to the New York episode as the example that had taught them this gentle habit in the first place. A single pulled cartoon had become a lesson in kindness, a reminder to read the room when the world is hurting. There is something tender in the lesson the New York episode teaches, and it differs from every other story so far. An episode does not have to do anything wrong to lose its place on the air. It does not need to insult a country, mock a sacred figure, or hide a guilty secret. Sometimes a perfectly innocent piece of work simply finds itself standing in the path of history. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson was made with affection, drawn with care, and loved by its audience. It harmed no one and meant no harm. Yet for a few years it became unwatchable, not because of anything inside it, but because of everything that had happened outside it. The episode stayed exactly the same, while the meaning of its setting was rewritten by tragedy. And once enough time had passed for the country to breathe again, the show treated the episode the way it deserved, welcoming it quietly back home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The New York episode had been set aside out of grief, and then gently welcomed back once the wound had time to close over. The very last stop on this long journey through the show's troubles brings a problem of a different shape, one all about terrible timing. There was an episode built entirely around the Catholic faith, finished and scheduled and waiting for its night to air. Then, in the very same week it was meant to play, the leader of the world's Catholics, the Pope himself, passed away. All at once, a lighthearted cartoon teasing the church felt like the worst imaginable thing to put on television, and the people in charge had to scramble to figure out out what to do. The strangest twist of all would arrive years later, when the very church the episode poked fun at decided that, after all was said and done, it rather liked The Simpsons. Section 10. The episode that waited for the Pope. The final stop on this long road through the show's troubles is a story about timing, and about how the cruelest thing about a joke is sometimes not the joke itself, but the exact moment it arrives. There was an episode built entirely around the Catholic faith, finished and polished and locked onto the calendar, simply waiting for its scheduled night to air. Then, in the very same week it was meant to play, the most beloved religious leader on the planet died. All at once, a cheerful cartoon poking fun at the church became the worst possible thing to put on television, and the people in charge had to act fast. The episode was called The Father, the Son, and the Holy Guest Star, and the strangest part of its story would not arrive until years later, when the very church it teased decided that it rather liked The Simpsons after all. To understand the trouble, the episode itself has to be laid out first. It served as a closing episode of the show's 16th season back in 2005. The story begins, as so many do, with Bart in trouble. During a big medieval-themed fair held at his school, a prank goes wrong, and although Bart is not actually the one who caused it, he takes the blame and gets thrown out of Springfield Elementary for good. With her son suddenly expelled and nowhere left to send him, Marge makes a choice that surprises the whole family. She enrolls Bart in the local Catholic school, a place run by priests and built around the Catholic branch of the Christian faith. Now, The Simpsons had always been shown attending a different kind of church, a gentle, low-key, Protestant-style congregation led by the mild Reverend Lovejoy. So sending Bart into a Catholic school was a real shift, and the episode knew it. At the Catholic school, Bart meets a warm and friendly Irish priest named Father Sean, voiced by the well-known actor Liam Neeson. Father Sean turns out to be the perfect match for Bart, because the priest had been a wild troublemaker himself in his younger days before turning his life around. Rather than scold Bart, Father Sean understands him. He hands the boy a colorful comic book full of dramatic, action-packed stories about saints, the holy heroes of the Catholic faith, and Bart is instantly hooked. Through those exciting tales, Bart finds himself drawn deeper and deeper into Catholicism, and he begins to embrace it as his own. Marge does not take this well at all. She grows anxious watching her son drift toward a different faith than the one she raised him in, fretting over all the unfamiliar customs, the kneeling and standing and rituals she does not share. Things spin even further out of her control when Homer gets involved. Homer marches off to the Catholic school, fully intending to confront Father Sean and put a stop to all this. Instead, the moment Homer arrives, he gets completely swept up himself. He discovers that the church throws a wonderful pancake dinner, followed by a game of bingo, and Homer, ever ruled by his stomach and his whims, is delighted. Then he learns the part that truly wins him over. In the Catholic faith, there is a practice called confession, where a person can privately tell a priest about all the bad things they have done and be forgiven for them. To Homer, a man with a very long list of sins, the idea of wiping the slate clean sounds like a miracle. So Homer decides he wants to become Catholic too. With both her husband and her son now leaning toward a new faith, Marge's worry boils over into something close to panic. The thing that frightens her most is a strange and oddly touching fear about what comes after death. Marge imagines that heaven might be divided up, with a separate area for Protestants and a separate area for Catholics, and she becomes terrified that if Homer and Bart convert, she will end up spending all of eternity completely alone, cut off from her own family by a line drawn between faiths. That fear drives the rest of the episode. Marge, teaming up with the devoutly religious neighbor Ned Flanders and Reverend Lovejoy, sets out to rescue Bart and Homer and pull them back before they can convert, leading to a big chaotic chase at a church festival. The way the episode wraps up is actually rather thoughtful, and it shines a light on what the writers were really after. Bart, the boy at the center of all this fighting, ends up delivering a message about how the different branches of the faith should stop quarreling and simply get along, since they share far more than they disagree about. For a moment, peace breaks out. Then the show pulls one of its clever, darkly funny tricks. It leaps far into the distant future and reveals that Bart's simple plea for everyone to get along has itself been twisted into a brand new religion whose followers have split into rival groups, now bitterly at war with one another over what Bart's message of peace truly meant. In a single stroke, the show poked fun not at any one faith, but at the endless human habit of taking a message of love and turning it into a reason to fight. The episode was also flagged with a special warning at the start advising viewers to use their own judgment, a note the show attached to only a handful of its episodes over the years. Here is the important thing to understand about the episode. For all its teasing, it was not especially mean toward the Catholic Church. Father Sean is one of the most likable guest characters in the whole story, kind and wise and genuinely good for Bart. The pancake dinners and the bingo are shown as warm and welcoming. If anything, the episode treats Catholicism with a certain fondness, while saving its sharpest jab for the way people of all faiths love to argue and divide. On any ordinary week, it would have aired as just another clever, slightly cheeky Simpsons story, the kind that gently ribs religion without truly attacking it. The problem was that the week it was meant to air turned out to be anything but ordinary. The episode had been set to play on a Sunday night in early April of 2005. But just over a week before that scheduled date, something happened that brought a great deal of the world to a standstill. Pope John Paul II, the leader of the entire Catholic Church, died. For most people alive at the time, he was the only pope they had ever known. He had led the world's Catholics for more than a quarter of a century, traveled to more countries than any pope before him, and was loved and respected far beyond the Catholic faith itself. His death was enormous news everywhere on earth. Vast crowds poured into the city of Rome to mourn him. His funeral drew one of the largest gatherings of kings, presidents, and world leaders ever assembled in one place, and millions of ordinary people came to pay their respects or watch the ceremony from home with tears in their eyes. For the world's Catholics especially, it was a moment of deep and genuine grief. Against that backdrop, the timing of the Simpsons episode suddenly looked like a disaster waiting to happen. Here was a lighthearted cartoon built around poking fun at the Catholic Church, scheduled to air just a couple of days after the funeral of the most important Catholic in the world. Airing a comedy that played the church for laughs while millions were still openly mourning its fallen leader would have been seen as cruel, tasteless, and deeply disrespectful. The people in charge at the Fox network recognized the problem at once. They pulled the episode from its April date entirely, leaving that Sunday night without a new episode at all, rather than risk the offense. The story about Bart and Homer flirting with Catholicism was quietly shelved and held back, set aside until a more fitting time. That more fitting time came the following month. The episode was rescheduled to air in the middle of May, where it ended up serving as the finale that closed out the whole season. By then, several weeks had passed since the Pope's death. The world had buried John Paul II, mourned him properly, and even welcomed his successor, the new Pope chosen to take his place. With the rawest part of the grief behind everyone, a gentle cartoon about the Catholic Church no longer felt like a slap in the face. So the episode finally aired, weeks later than planned, slipping out at the tail end of the season without any further fuss. The show had simply waited, holding its tongue out of respect until the moment was right. This careful handling rhymes with something seen earlier in the show's history. The New York episode had been quietly pulled from reruns after the towers fell, set aside out of respect for a grieving nation, and then welcomed back once enough time had passed. The Catholic episode was treated with the very same instinct, just in reverse order. One episode was pulled after a tragedy struck, the other was held back before it could air, the moment it became clear that real-world sorrow had made its timing unbearable. In both cases, the show was doing the same thoughtful thing, reading the mood of a hurting world and choosing to step softly. For a program so famous for being loud, rude, and fearless, these quiet moments of restraint say something worth noticing. The writers were willing to poke at almost anything, yet they understood there were moments when the kindest move was to simply stay silent and let people grieve. The strangest twist in the whole tale, though, was still years away, and it flipped the entire story on its head. Around 5 years after the episode finally aired, the official newspaper of the Vatican, the very heart of the Catholic Church in Rome, published an article about The Simpsons. The world braced for a scolding. What came instead was a warm embrace. The Vatican paper looked back at this exact episode, the one that had once seemed too risky to air near the Pope's funeral, and used it to make a cheerful argument. The article suggested that Homer and Bart Simpson were, deep down, truly Catholic. It pointed to their fondness for the church in the episode, and went so far as to say that parents had nothing to fear in letting their children watch the adventures of the little yellow family. The church that the episode had teased was now claiming The Simpsons as its own. The show's own creators found the whole thing rather funny, and gently pushed back. They pointed out that the family had always belonged to their own small-town Protestant-style church, not the Catholic Church, and that The Simpsons were never meant to be Catholic at all. So the odd situation arose where the Vatican was insisting a cartoon family belonged to it, while the people who actually made the cartoon politely disagreed. An episode that had once been considered too disrespectful to air in a week of mourning had somehow transformed, over time, into something the church itself wanted to claim as a friend. The fear had curdled into affection. The thing once held back out of worry had become a thing held up with approval. There is a fitting kind of lesson in how this final story played out, and it pulls together a thread running through everything that came before. So much of the trouble the show landed in came down to timing and context rather than the jokes themselves. The New Orleans song was was the same song whether it aired in a calm year or a week after a hurricane, yet the meaning changed entirely depending on when it played. The New York episode was the same cartoon before and after the towers fell, but the world around it decided what it meant. And this Catholic episode was the same gentle, affectionate story whether it aired in a week of mourning or a quiet week in May, but only one of those weeks could hold it. A joke does not live in a vacuum. It lands in a particular moment in front of particular people carrying particular wounds, and the moment can turn the very same words from harmless fun into something that cuts deep, or back again into something a church will happily claim. Looking back over the whole long parade of trouble, a clear shape begins to emerge from it. A cartoon family of bright yellow characters managed, across its many years in the air, to feud with a president, enrage an American city, draw a lawsuit threat from a foreign country, get itself banned outright in another, vanish twice at the hands of a powerful government, nearly get killed by its own network, force a reckoning over a beloved character, erase one of its own episodes forever, get pulled from the air by a national tragedy, and finally, wait politely in the wings for the world to finish mourning a pope. No other show has bumped into the real world this often, in this many ways, across this many countries, and this many years. And when all of these stories are gathered up and laid side by side, a single deeper question rises up out of the pile of them. A question about why this one silly cartoon, more than almost any other show ever made, keeps colliding again and again with the real and serious world it was only ever trying to make laugh. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.